At 2:18 a.m., dispatch sent my engine to a fire alarm at a closed gym. My wife was inside with a married owner after texting me that she was already in bed. I had been a firefighter, paramedic for 11 years, long enough to know that the call itself was ordinary. Automatic alarms came in for steam, electrical faults, overheated equipment, and enough burnt food that nobody treated a quiet commercial alarm like a guaranteed fire until we got eyes on it. Northline Athletic Club was outside our normal first due area. The engine that usually covered it was tied up on a serious traffic collision, so dispatch moved us across district lines and sent our crew instead. We rolled out less than a minute after the tones. My name is Jack Turner. I was 37 then, married to Samantha for 9 years and working the same 24-hour schedule I had worked for most of our marriage. We had no children, so most of the calendar coordination in our house was about work, appointments, trips, and the life the two of us had built together. I started at 7 in the morning, and if the city stayed quiet enough, went home at 7 the next morning. Samantha knew that schedule as well as I did. We kept my shifts on a shared calendar, because our entire household depended on them. Appointments, dinners, weekend plans, and the occasional trade when somebody at the station needed a day. There was nothing secret about when I worked, and for 9 years I had considered that ordinary marriage logistics. At 12:07 that night she had texted me, "Going to sleep. Hope the shift stays quiet. Love you." I answered that I loved her too and went back to cleaning equipment with one of the younger guys. 2 hours later, our engine turned into Northline's dark parking lot, and I saw Samantha's SUV. My mind did not go straight to an affair. I wondered whether the car had broken down earlier, whether she had loaned it to someone, or whether some emergency had brought her there, and she had decided not to bother me while I was working. Those explanations started collapsing before I got off the engine. The alarm panel was visible through the glass entry doors, and the only other vehicle near the building belonged to Mason Reed. I knew the truck because Samantha had been a Northline member for almost 2 years. Mason was one of the owners, the public face of the gym, and the man she mentioned often enough that I knew what he drove without ever deciding to learn it. Our captain assigned positions, while another firefighter retrieved building access from the lockbox. The alarm panel indicated a detector in the rear recovery area near the sauna and equipment room, so we entered under normal commercial alarm procedure and started checking the zone. There was no heavy smoke and no visible fire from the main floor. The building smelled faintly electrical, a warm plastic odor that makes you take a call seriously, even when the room in front of you looks normal. I was halfway down the corridor toward the recovery rooms when Mason stepped out from behind an employee's only door. He wore joggers and a sweatshirt, rather than workout clothes, and the surprise on his face was immediate. Samantha came out behind him. She had on leggings, a long sweater. Nothing about her clothes proved what they had been doing. But the time, the locked building, her midnight message, and the way both of them froze when they saw me made explanations harder by the second. Samantha said my name. I looked at our captain instead and told him, "That is my wife." He understood without asking for details. Another firefighter took over communication with Mason and Samantha, while the captain kept me on the equipment check. Samantha stepped toward me and said, "Jack, wait." I kept my voice low enough that only the people nearest us could hear. "Not while I am working." Then I went past her and returned to the alarm zone. That was not restraint for show. We still had an active alarm in a closed commercial building, and whatever my wife had been doing could wait until I was no longer responsible for the safety of everyone standing inside it. If I let the marriage take over the call, I would have turned my personal crisis into everybody else's safety problem. The problem turned out to be a towel warming unit in the recovery area. Part of its electrical control housing had overheated and produced enough smoke to activate the detector. We isolated power, checked the surrounding wall and cabinetry with thermal imaging, ventilated the area, and confirmed there was no extension. Nobody was hurt, the structure was fine, and the building could remain closed until the equipment was repaired. Mason answered property questions through the firefighter assigned to him. Samantha stayed near the front of the building and tried twice to catch my eye. I did not ask where she had been sitting, how long she had been there, or what was behind the employee's only door. I was not going to turn an emergency scene into a marriage interrogation while wearing department gear. When the captain released the property back to Mason, we cleared the call and returned to service. Nobody on the engine tried to make a joke out of what they had seen. The captain quietly asked whether I wanted someone to cover the remaining hours of my shift, and I told him I was still capable of doing the job. He accepted that and left it alone. I spent the rest of the night awake, because ordinary pieces of the previous 12 hours kept replaying with different meanings. Samantha had asked what I wanted for dinner before shift, kissed me goodbye that morning, and sent a message after midnight saying she was going to bed. My job made certain absences unusually predictable. On a normal office day, somebody can leave early, forget something, or decide to come home for lunch. A 24-hour house shift is different, unless I traded out, got injured, or was relieved for an emergency of my own. Samantha could look at the calendar and know the house was hers until the next morning. I had always treated that predictability as trust. The part I could not stop thinking about was whether she had started treating it as opportunity. At 7, I changed out of my uniform and drove home. Samantha was waiting at the kitchen table and looked as if she had not slept either. Before I asked a question, she said Mason had called because something was wrong at the gym. I stayed near the end of the table instead of sitting beside her. You are an office manager at a dental group. What exactly were you helping a gym owner fix at 2 in the morning? Her first explanation lasted less than a minute. Mason had supposedly worried about an equipment issue, and Samantha said she went over because she had noticed a strange smell during a recovery session earlier in the week. I asked why she had texted me that she was going to sleep. She said she had intended to sleep and changed her mind when Mason contacted her. Then I asked why a gym owner needed a member to help with an electrical problem at 2 in the morning. Samantha stopped defending that part and admitted they had been talking. In a closed gym after 2, it wasn't supposed to get that late. Then why tell me you were in bed? She rubbed her hands together before answering. Because I knew how it would look. That answer mattered more than the equipment story. If she knew how it would look, she knew she was hiding something before the alarm ever sounded. I sat across from her and asked how long she and Mason had been meeting or talking outside normal gym hours. Samantha called it a few months. When I asked whether the relationship was physical, she started with kissing and said the emotional part came first. I asked directly whether she had slept with him, and after lowering her eyes, she admitted that she had. I asked how long the sexual relationship had been going on. Samantha answered, about 3 months. I did not believe the number, not because I had contrary evidence yet, but because every answer had become narrower only after the previous version stopped working. Samantha said she never intended for it to become an affair. Mason began paying extra attention to her during training. They talked after sessions, and then they started meeting for coffee. She also said something I had heard in softer forms during the previous year. I was gone for full days, and our life always seemed to be arranged around a firehouse calendar. That schedule was not new. It existed before our wedding. And for years, Samantha had said she liked some of the nights alone. She ordered food I did not like, watched whatever she wanted, and took over the entire bed. Only recently had the schedule become evidence in her mind that our life was too predictable. Trips required planning, some weekend events required shift trades, and a dinner could disappear if I got held over on a call. She had begun talking about friends who could book a weekend on Thursday and leave Friday, or couples who seemed to reinvent themselves every few years. At the time, I assumed she wanted more travel or a change of routine. What I had missed was that predictability itself had started to feel like a defect to her. Then I asked whether Mason knew my schedule. Samantha said he knew some of it. I asked whether Mason had known I was on a 24-hour shift the previous night. She admitted that he had, and when I asked how, she answered, I told him. That was the first answer she gave all morning without trying to soften it. Mason knew I was a firefighter. He knew I worked 24-hour shifts, knew I normally could not leave the station except on calls, and knew when Samantha expected me home. Samantha had not merely mentioned my profession in passing. She had given the man she was sleeping with information that made my absences predictable. I stood and moved toward the sink because the conversation was starting to feel like an interview. Samantha told me Mason's marriage was already bad. When I asked whether that made his involvement in mine better, she said it did not. Then she tried to explain why she liked him. Mason was spontaneous. He did things without planning weeks ahead, made her feel noticed, and talked about changing careers, building something new, and not letting life become a list of routines. I heard the contrast clearly. I was the routine and the schedule. Mason was the part of life that happened while I was gone. I asked whether she wanted to leave me. Samantha said no so quickly that I did not trust the certainty. When I asked whether she wanted to be with Mason, she took longer before saying she did not know. I ended the conversation there, moved some clothes into the spare room, and told Samantha I needed space. I also told her I would not use department systems, incident records, or anything available to me because of my job to investigate her. What I saw on the call was enough to confront her. Anything else would have to come from information I had a normal right to know. Samantha looked offended by the word investigate and said she had never asked me to start checking up on her. I told her, "Number, you asked me to believe 3 months," and left before the argument restarted. That afternoon, an email appeared in my city work account with the subject line Northline, per milliamp per son read. It was from Aaron Reed. Samantha had mentioned Mason's wife before, usually in passing. Aaron handled much of Northline's finance and business administration, while Mason focused on members, trainers, sales, and the public face of the gym. Samantha used to describe Mason as the owner, because he was the person members saw everywhere. But I knew enough by then to understand that Aaron was not simply the owner's wife. Northline was jointly owned by Mason and Aaron. Her message said she had been one of the registered alarm contacts notified overnight. Mason told her he had gone to Northline because of an equipment problem. But the building's access system showed his owner credential opening the gym before the alarm activated. She also knew from Mason that Samantha's husband had been one of the firefighters on scene. Aaron had searched the city's public staff directory, found my department email, and used that instead of trying to get my personal number through Samantha's membership account. Aaron asked me to call if I was willing to compare what each of us already knew. I called her from my personal phone. She did not ask for fire department records or details outside what I had personally witnessed. Her first real question was narrower. "How long has your wife been meeting my husband after closing?" I told her Samantha had admitted the affair and claimed it had been physical for about 3 months. Aaron went quiet before saying, "That doesn't match what I am looking at." Northline's owner. Access history showed Mason repeatedly entering the building after closing on nights, when there was no staff event or scheduled maintenance. Aaron was careful not to claim the log proved Samantha had been present every time. It only proved Mason had been using the building after hours far longer than the 3-month version Samantha had given me. I asked how far back the pattern went, and Aaron answered without hesitation. 9 months. I looked at the shift calendar beside my desk. Until that call, I had been trying to understand one night at Northline. Now I wanted to know how many of those 9 months had been built around the nights. Samantha knew I could not come home. Aaron did not send me Northline's access log. She read dates from it while I opened the shift calendar Samantha and I had used for years. Aaron was looking at records she had a right to see as a co-owner, and I was looking at my own schedule. Neither of us needed access to the other person's systems to test whether the pattern meant anything. The first date she read was from 8 months earlier, and I had worked that day. The second date also matched one of my 24-hour shifts, and so did the third. By the time we reached the 7th entry, I stopped treating the overlap like coincidence. Aaron had 17 after-hours entries tied to Mason's owner credential over the previous 9 months. 14 fell on nights when my calendar showed me at the station. She was careful about what that did and did not prove. The log showed Mason entering Northline after closing. It did not identify every person who entered with him, and neither of us was going to pretend Samantha had been present every time. The problem was what happened when I compared those dates with my own phone. 14 matches were already too many, especially because my 24-hour shifts were spread across the month, rather than concentrated on weekends. The overlap followed my absences, not the gym's normal business rhythm. On one of those nights, Samantha had texted that she was exhausted and turning in early. On another, she said she had ordered takeout and planned to watch a movie alone. A third was the night she told me she had a headache and would probably be asleep before 10. Those messages had stayed on my phone because they seemed completely ordinary when I received them. Now they looked like cover. There was another pattern I could see only after Aaron supplied the dates. When I traded a shift, our shared calendar changed immediately. Samantha always knew because that was the point of keeping it shared. If I picked up overtime, the calendar changed. If another firefighter covered me for a weekend, the calendar changed again. For years, that system had made our marriage easier. During the affair, it had made my absence dependable. I ended the call with Erin after we finished the dates and drove home. Samantha was in the kitchen. This time I did not ask whether the affair had lasted 3 months. I asked why Mason's after-hours access went back 9. Her expression changed before she answered. She tried to divide the relationship into categories. The first few months were conversations after training, then private messages and coffee, then kissing, and only later sex. I asked when the first after-hours meeting at North Line happened. She gave me a date from roughly 9 months earlier. My calendar showed I had been on shift. The next date she remembered matched another shift, and the one after that did too. By the fourth date, Samantha understood what I was testing. "Did you check my shifts before you made plans with him?" She looked away. "Sometimes." I asked whether she had ever changed plans with Mason, because I traded a shift. Her answer took long enough to become an answer by itself. Eventually, she admitted it happened once. I had swapped a Saturday with another firefighter, and she and Mason moved to dinner to the following week. That detail did more damage than another hotel receipt could have. They were not simply taking advantage of nights I happened to work. They were adjusting around changes in my availability. I asked how long they had actually been sleeping together. Samantha finally said about 7 months. That was the third timeline she had given me in less than 2 days. Northline was not the only place they met. There had been hotels, dinners, and a few afternoons when Samantha left work early. The gym was simply convenient because Mason had owner access, and nobody expected members to be there after closing. I asked whether Mason ever objected to arranging things around my schedule. Samantha said he thought the 24-hour shifts made things easier. That sentence stayed with me. My job was not merely a fact Mason tolerated. It had become part of the operating system of their relationship. My anger had changed by then. Seeing them at Northline had been one brutal image. The calendar was worse, because it showed repetition and choice. Samantha had not made one impulsive decision on one lonely night. She had learned which absences were dependable, shared that certainty with Mason, and kept sending me ordinary bedtime messages while the pattern continued. I still could not say she had been present for every one of Mason's 17 entries, but I no longer needed that claim to understand what she had admitted about the nights that were hers. After that conversation, I called a divorce attorney. I did not know yet whether I would file immediately, but I knew enough to stop treating our financial plans as though the marriage were normal. The attorney heard the affair timeline, the way the meetings followed my shifts, and the details of the joint renovation account Samantha and I had been building for our house. The advice was straightforward. Preserve records, leave existing joint money alone, avoid hiding assets, and do not begin large optional joint projects while the marriage was in dispute. I downloaded statements showing the $58,000 renovation balance and saved copies of the contractor estimates we had already approved. Then I canceled the automatic transfer that earmarked part of every overtime check for the renovation fund. The existing $58,000 stayed where it was, and I did not remove Samantha's access to it. New overtime simply remained in my ordinary account, fully visible for the lawyers and whatever the eventual settlement required. I also paused the contractor appointments for the kitchen project. It was not a dramatic transfer or a punishment disguised as financial planning. I stopped earmarking new money for a shared home project, while Samantha was still deciding whether she wanted that future at all. Samantha noticed the canceled transfer before dinner and came into the spare room asking what I was doing. I told her the renovation was paused while we spoke to lawyers. She said I could not make decisions about our money by myself. I agreed that I could not take the existing fund as if it belonged only to me. What I could do was stop earmarking new overtime for a renovation neither of us should start while the marriage was uncertain. She asked whether I had already decided to divorce her. I told her I had decided only that we were not signing new contractor agreements, while she was still changing the timeline of the affair. That answer made her angry because it left no dramatic accusation to fight. At that point, Samantha thought I was reacting only to the affair. Neither of us yet understood what else the same fund had been expected to finance. Erin called me again the next day. This time, the conversation moved beyond the access log. Northline offered a premium membership tier that normally cost a little over $200 a month. Samantha had been on it for most of the previous year, but Aaron discovered that Mason changed the account to complimentary status 8 months earlier. Samantha had told me Northline was running a loyalty promotion for long-term members. There had been no loyalty promotion. Aaron had also flagged several expenses for Northline's accountant, including 2 dinners coded as member development, a hotel charge under a vendor meeting category, and a handful of smaller hospitality charges. The total was still under $5,000. That made the pattern more believable, not less. Mason had not emptied the company to finance some fantasy life. He had used small pieces of an existing business to make the affair easier. A free membership, a private place after closing, meals that could be described as business, and at least one hotel charge that might have passed through accounting without attracting attention. Erin was not calling every charge improper. She was sending receipts and dates to the accountants so the business purpose could be checked. Then she told me about something larger. Mason had been asking Northline vendors for pricing on a recovery studio. At first, that meant nothing to me. Aaron explained that over several months he had requested quotes for infrared saunas, mobility equipment, recovery tables, cold plunge systems, and a smaller commercial space. Some requests had gone through Northline's existing vendor relationships, and preliminary branding work had been done as well. She had originally assumed Mason was exploring a second Northline location. The documents showed otherwise. The material referred to a separate venture that Northline did not own. Nothing had been formally launched, no lease had been signed, and no new business was operating. But Aaron had found planning notes that included Samantha in a management role, with one draft discussing possible 10% equity, that connected several conversations I had treated as unrelated. Samantha had been talking about leaving the dental group for months. At first, I thought she was burned out. She complained about scheduling, insurance calls, staff turnover, and spending every day solving small problems for people who rarely noticed. Then the complaints became more ambitious. She started saying she wanted to build something, instead of managing somebody else's routine. I had encouraged her to look around. I even told her we could handle a temporary income drop if she found work she cared about. What she never mentioned was Mason Northline Recovery Studio, or the possibility that she might own part of it. I went home and asked her directly. The change in Samantha was immediate. The affair made her ashamed and defensive, but the studio made her protective. She insisted Northline Recovery Studio was a legitimate career opportunity. Mason wanted a smaller operation, focused on recovery, mobility, sauna services, and higher-end personal training. And he believed Samantha could run operations and member experience. That part made sense. She had years of administrative experience, was good with people, and understood the constant small problems that could sink a service business if nobody handled them. The problem was that her husband was hearing the most important career plan of her life only because the wife of the man she was sleeping with discovered it in business records. I asked whether Mason had promised her ownership. Samantha said they had discussed 10% if she invested and joined full-time. The investment would have been somewhere between $35,000 and $40,000. I asked where that money was supposed to come from. Her pause answered before she did. The $58,000 renovation fund. She quickly emphasized that she had not transferred anything. Mason was still working on numbers. No lease had been signed, no operating agreement existed, and the equity terms were only a draft. I asked when she planned to tell me. When there was something real to discuss. I looked at her long enough that she understood why the answer failed. The affair had been real for 9 months. The business planning had been real enough for vendors, equipment quotes, branding drafts, and an equity percentage. Yet our marriage apparently did not qualify for a conversation until Mason's new company became formal enough to need our money. I asked whether she had expected me to agree to $40,000 once. Mason produced documents. Samantha said she would have explained that it was an investment in her career, and that the renovation could wait. I asked whether she planned to explain that Mason was also the man she had been sleeping with. Samantha let the question sit. That was when the transfer I had canceled the previous day changed, meaning I had stopped contributing because our marriage was in dispute. Now, I knew Samantha had also been keeping the same pool of money available, while she waited to see whether a business with Mason became real enough to fund. I asked whether she intended to leave me if the studio opened. Samantha said she did not know. She hated the dental group and wanted something that felt like hers. Mason believed she could do more than manage somebody else's office, and if the studio succeeded, she could have ownership instead of remaining an employee. I asked where Mason's marriage fit into the plan. Samantha repeated that he and Erin had been unhappy for years, and said Mason intended to leave. There was no date. Then I asked what happened if the studio failed or Mason stayed married. Samantha accused me of trying to turn everything into a trap. I was trying to understand the sequence. She wanted to keep our marriage while Mason proved whether the studio was real. She wanted the renovation fund available. Her dental job remained the backup until the new role could support her, and Mason's marriage remained unresolved until he decided what he was willing to do. I was the safe version of Samantha's life while she tested the exciting one. She argued that the studio and the affair were separate issues. I asked how they could be separate when the proposed business partner was the man she had been sleeping with for 7 months. It is a legitimate career opportunity. Then why was your husband the last person to know your new business partner was the man you were sleeping with? Nothing, she said. After that improved the situation. Samantha told me she could invest her own money if she still wanted the opportunity. I told her that was something she could discuss with her attorney. What she could not do is assume a fund we built for our home would quietly become startup capital for a business I learned about through Mason's wife. Erin called again that evening. Her accountant had begun separating legitimate Northline expenses from charges that appeared personal, but the financial review was still early. The larger issue had become the recovery studio. Erin's business attorney had reviewed the planning material and vendor correspondence. Mason had used Northline relationships to obtain equipment pricing, contractor estimates, preliminary branding work, and staff assistance for a business Northline did not own. Some of that work might have been harmless exploration if both owners had approved it. Erin had not approved it. Then she said one sentence that changed what I thought the next fight would be about. Mason has been using Northline vendors, staff time, and company relationships to build a business Northline doesn't own. I looked at the renovation account statement on my desk. The affair had used my schedule. The new life they were planning had been using Erin's company. Erin did not shut down the recovery studio herself. She called a business attorney, first because Northline was not Mason's personal company, and she did not want to turn a marriage fight into a business decision she could not defend later. Her attorney reviewed the vendor emails, preliminary equipment quotes, internal staff work, and draft material tied to the proposed recovery business. The advice was straightforward. If Northline did not own the new venture, and both owners had not approved supporting it, company resources should not keep flowing to it. Northline's accountant and counsel put that boundary into writing. Vendors were told that future recovery studio pricing needed to be quoted directly to the new entity rather than through Northline's accounts. Staff were told not to spend company time on the project without documented Northline approval. Brand files and member lists were off limits, and the company card could not be used for exploratory expenses tied to a separate business. Existing contractor introductions would also have to be restarted under whatever company Mason actually formed. Erin did not cancel a lease because there was no lease to cancel, and she did not seize a company because no new company was operating. She simply stopped a jointly owned business from quietly carrying startup costs for a venture she had never approved. That change reached Samantha faster than I expected. She came home from work 2 evenings later and walked into the spare room while I was folding laundry. Mason says Erin is sabotaging the studio. I set down the shirt in my hands and asked what Erin had actually done. Samantha said she had cut off vendor pricing and told Northline staff not to help anymore. I asked whether those were Northline employees working on a business Northline did not own. Samantha frowned and told me I knew that was not the point. It was exactly the point. I asked how the recovery studio was supposed to pay for those things now. Mason would have to establish independent vendor accounts, get new quotes, and pay normal rates, instead of relying on Northline's existing relationships. The numbers had already changed. Equipment discounts Mason assumed he could obtain through Northline disappeared. A contractor, who had worked for the gym, wanted a fresh commercial deposit before preparing another detailed estimate. Branding work that one Northline employee had been doing between other assignments would now have to go to an outside agency. Mason had been talking as though roughly $150,000 could get the studio through opening. Once the project had to stand on its own accounts. The working budget pushed past $230,000. The higher figure included independent equipment pricing, deposits, outside branding, insurance, lease-related costs, and enough working capital to survive the first few months. Samantha's proposed $35,000 or $40,000 had once sounded like a meaningful part of the plan. Now it looked like a small minority contribution to a much larger risk. I asked whether Mason still intended to fund the rest. He says he needs to recalculate. That answer told me the project had changed from exciting to expensive. Samantha heard the same thing. She called Mason from the kitchen later that night. I did not stand nearby to listen, but she told me about the conversation afterward because she was angry. Mason said the studio was not dead. The timing was simply bad. He needed to know what would happen with Aaron and Northline before putting more money into another company, and he wanted legal advice before making commitments. Samantha reminded him that he had spent months telling her the project was ready to move once they found the right lease. According to her, Mason answered, that was before Aaron knew. The sentence hurt more than he probably intended. Before Aaron knew, Northline's vendor relationships were available. Staff time could disappear into normal operations, and some exploratory expenses could be absorbed without attracting much attention. Mason had been able to talk about the studio as if his own willingness were the only thing separating an idea from a real business. Now, he had to pay the actual price. Samantha could already see the difference. She was already doing the math herself, and the tone of our conversations about the studio changed. She stopped talking about when it would open and started asking whether Mason could still afford it. The next useful piece came from my schedule. Aaron had 17 after-hours access dates, and 14 of them matched my 24 shifts. I made a clean list from my personal calendar and sent her only the dates I had been scheduled to work. There was no incident information, dispatch history, station documentation, or anything else connected to department systems. It was simply my own work calendar. Aaron compared those dates with records she already had. Several overlaps also lined up with expenses. Northline's accountant was reviewing. One hotel charge fell on a shift night, as did 2 dinners. Samantha's complimentary membership had begun shortly after the after-hours pattern started. The dates did not prove every charge was improper, but they gave the accountant a place to test receipts, attendees, and business purpose. After that review, the hotel charge and 2 of the dinners could not be supported as Northline business expenses. Together with smaller personal items, a little under $3,800 was reclassified, and Mason reimbursed the company. Other charges remained business expenses because the record supported them. The fact that some charges remained legitimate made the finding harder for Mason to dismiss as a blanket attempt to punish him by separating what the record supported from what they did not. The accountant gave the reimbursement a clear basis. The same timeline mattered to Aaron's divorce attorney because it showed Mason's private use of Northline after hours was not a one-night anomaly created by the fire alarm. He had been using the building that way for months. I had not called Northline members, contacted employees, posted screenshots online, or tried to embarrass Mason publicly. I gave one lawful piece of information I owned to the person whose company records already contained the other half of the pattern. Samantha found out almost immediately because Mason told her. She confronted me in the kitchen and accused me of giving Aaron my entire schedule. I told her I had given Aaron the dates I worked. You knew what she would do with them. Compare them with her own records. You are helping her build a case against him. I am helping her understand how her property and company money were being used. Samantha crossed her arms and said Aaron and I were trying to destroy everything. I asked what she meant by everything. Our marriage, Northline, the studio, or her relationship with Mason. She had no clean answer because all 4 had become connected by choices she still wanted treated as separate. You knew what my schedule would let you do for 9 months, I told her. Now Aaron knows what hers was being used for. Samantha stared at me and, for once, did not argue that the schedule had been incidental. The larger problem on Mason's side was no longer the studio alone. Erin had decided she could not remain married to him and continue running Northline as though nothing had happened. That did not mean she could simply remove him. Northline belonged to both of them. Mason handled trainers, sales, member relationships, programming, and much of the public-facing side of the business. Erin handled finance, payroll, leases, vendors, insurance, and administrative control. They had built the place together. Divorce meant they had to decide what happened to the company. Mason's first position was predictable. He wanted to buy Erin out. He believed Northline's identity was tied to him. Members knew him, trainers followed his programs, and his face appeared in local marketing. In his mind, Erin would prefer cash and a clean exit while he kept the business that people associated with his name. Erin did not agree. She wanted an independent business valuation before discussing any buyout. Her position was not that Mason deserved to lose Northline because he cheated. She wanted to know what the company was actually worth before deciding whether either spouse could realistically buy the other out. That distinction mattered because Mason had spent months selling Samantha a picture of himself as someone who could simply choose his next move. The valuation forced every choice into numbers: financing, ownership rights, and risk. That was where Mason's confidence started running into arithmetic. Northline had grown beyond the small training facility. They opened years earlier. It had recurring memberships, commercial equipment, a favorable lease, established cash flow, local brand recognition, and a customer base that gave the business value beyond the equipment inside it. Any buyout also had to account for the financial consequences of their divorce. Mason could not simply choose a number he considered affordable and expect Erin to accept it. He needed financing substantial enough to purchase her interest while protecting his own position through the divorce. Erin told me only broad details, which was enough. What mattered was the gap between the man Mason had presented to Samantha and the business reality underneath him. He did not own Northline by himself. The lease relationships were shared, the vendor accounts belonged to the company, and the cash flow supported both owners. Even the brand Mason treated like an extension of his personality had value that Erin had helped build. Samantha started seeing the difference too, before the fire alarm. She talked about Mason as if he controlled Northline completely. He was the man who unlocked the doors, knew every trainer, moved through the gym like it belonged to him, and spoke about future locations as if permission were a formality. After the valuation process began, her language changed. She complained that Erin controlled the money, that financing was becoming difficult, and that lawyers were treating Mason as though he could not make decisions about his own business. What she called interference was really the discovery that ownership had always been shared. Mason had looked independent because Erin handled the parts of the business members rarely saw. Once the marriage broke apart, those invisible systems became impossible to pretend away. I reminded her that it was not only his business. That answer always irritated her because it punctured the version of Mason she had been buying into for months. Mason explored several ways to finance a buyout. Borrowing enough would put more of his personal assets at risk. Bringing in another investor would reduce the control he expected to keep. Selling other assets was complicated by the divorce itself. Samantha had never heard this version of Mason before. The man who used to talk about opening another studio as though capital would appear when he needed was now discussing loan terms, collateral, and whether a new investor would demand too much ownership. The remaining option was to sell Northline. He resisted that one longest. The business had become part of his identity. He liked being introduced as the owner, liked having members recognize him outside the gym, and liked telling Samantha that opening Recovery Studio would be easier, because he had already built one successful fitness company. Selling Northline would not make him poor. It would change the story he told about himself, because the title he used to impress Samantha would no longer belong to him. Meanwhile, Recovery Studio stopped moving. The lease search paused, equipment deposits were never placed, and the operating agreement remained a draft. No independent company account appeared, and the 10% stake Samantha had been promised remained something discussed rather than something she owned. Samantha kept describing the project as delayed rather than dead. I asked what she actually had. She said Mason was still working on it. I asked whether the 10% existed in signed documents. Samantha admitted it did not. There was no start date and no formal job offer either. So the life you were waiting to choose still doesn't exist. Samantha hated that sentence because she could not answer it with anything concrete. The version she had been protecting required several things to happen at the same time. Mason had to leave Aaron and keep control of Northline, or receive enough money from it to fund another project. The studio then had to become real, and Samantha still needed the promised role in equity. All of that had to happen after the affair damaged the business relationships that once made the project look cheap and easy. The plan had looked stable only while everybody providing the stability was kept in the dark. Once AR knew, the hidden business support disappeared. Once I knew, the renovation fund stopped being available by assumption. What Samantha had imagined as an exciting new life became a normal startup with real capital requirements and 2 divorces attached to it. Nothing magical had been taken away from them. They were being asked to fund and build their future with resources that actually belonged to them. Mason reacted to that change by delaying. Specific opening months disappeared from his conversations with Samantha. He told her the studio should wait until Northline was settled and advised her not to leave the dental group yet. That last part hit her hardest. For months, Mason had told Samantha she was wasting herself managing somebody else's office. Now that leaving required him to support a real transition. He was telling her to keep the safe job. She came home from meeting him and said, "He says the studio has to wait until Northline is settled." I asked how long that would take. She did not know. I asked whether the 10% was still guaranteed. Samantha said Mason had not changed his mind, but nothing was signed. Then I asked whether he still wanted her to leave the dental group. Samantha said, "Not yet." I nodded. "Then the future he sold you still isn't ready to exist." She accused me of enjoying what was happening. I told her I was not enjoying the divorce, the canceled renovation, or learning that my work calendar had been used to schedule an affair. What I did feel was relief that I stopped contributing money before their plan became real enough to consume it. That distinction did not comfort her. A week later, Aaron called with another update. The buyout discussions had stalled. Mason could not reach financing terms he liked, and Aaron was not willing to discount her interest, simply to preserve his position as Northline's public face. Continuing as co-owners after the divorce was becoming less realistic by the day. Their attorneys had started discussing a sale process. A regional fitness operator had already shown preliminary interest. Aaron said the likely structure would give both owners their share of the value and remove the need for either one to finance a buyout alone. Mason still disliked the idea because a sale solved the ownership problem by taking Northline away from both of them. Nothing was final, and no purchase agreement had been signed, but Northline was being valued for a possible sale. I thought about the way Samantha used to describe Mason before any of this happened. A successful owner, an independent man, somebody spontaneous enough to build what he wanted without waiting for permission. 9 months later, the affair had exposed how much of that freedom depended on a wife who handled the money, a company they owned together, and resources Mason had treated as if they belonged only to him. Samantha had spent 9 months imagining a future built around Mason's freedom. By then, even the business that made him look free was being priced for sale. Northline sold 4 months after the valuation process began. Mason spent part of that time still trying to keep it. He pursued buyout financing until the lender terms required more collateral and personal exposure than he was willing to accept, while Aaron would not discount her share, simply to preserve his position. Once neither spouse had a realistic buyout they could both accept, the sale became the cleanest business option. The buyer was a regional fitness operator that already owned several clubs in neighboring cities. It kept most of the staff, retained the Northline name during a transition period, and paid enough that Aaron and Mason could each receive the value of their ownership without either one having to finance a buyout of the other. Mason was not ruined. He still had sale proceeds, industry contacts, and more than a decade of experience in fitness. The buyer even offered him a short consulting agreement to help members and trainers through the transition. What disappeared was the identity he had used so easily around Samantha. He was no longer the owner of Northline. The difference was practical before it was symbolic. Mason could no longer unlock the building whenever he wanted, comp a membership because he felt like it, use staff between assignments, or route a new idea through vendor relationships belonging to a company he no longer controlled. He could still build another business if he wanted. He would simply have to build it with resources that were actually his. That was the part Samantha had never seen during the affair. Mason had looked fearless because the hardest pieces of his life were already built around him. An operating company, vendor credit, staff, a spouse handling finance, and a gym where he could move as though permission did not exist. Once those supports were separated by ownership and divorce, his choices became slower and more expensive. That condition finished what Aaron had already started with Recovery Studio. Without Northline's vendor accounts, staff help, brand assets, equipment pricing, and existing contractor relationships, the project never reached a signed lease. Mason did not place equipment deposits, open the new location, or execute an operating agreement. Samantha never received 10% of anything. For several weeks, she continued calling the studio delayed. Then even she stopped using the word. By that point, our divorce had moved into the ordinary parts that rarely feel dramatic while they are happening. The $58,000 renovation fund stayed where it was until our attorneys worked through the accounts. It was divided through the normal settlement process, rather than treated as mine because I had stopped contributing after the affair came out. The house had more equity than either of us expected, but neither one wanted to buy out the other and stay there. We agreed to sell. Because we had no children, there was no custody fight running beside the financial case. Retirement accounts were handled normally, and each of us kept the vehicle we already drove. There was no adultery penalty that erased Samantha's legal share of what we had built. I paid attorney fees, lost money to transaction costs, gave up the renovation we had spent 2 years planning, and watched a 9-year marriage turn into documents and signatures. The point of stopping the renovation fund had never been to take Samantha's money. It had been to stop feeding a shared future while she was quietly preparing another one. Once the divorce process established who owned what, I followed it. Aaron and I spoke less often after the Northline sale was signed, which was appropriate. We had never been friends before Mason and Samantha connected our lives, and neither of us needed the affair to create some permanent partnership between the two people who had been lied to. She told me once that her divorce was still moving forward, and that she intended to leave the fitness business after the transition. I wished her well. That was the last meaningful conversation we had. Samantha, however, still had one assumption left. Mason and Aaron were separating, our own divorce was moving toward completion, and Northline had been sold. She gradually began describing the sale as freedom rather than loss. In her version, Mason no longer had to fight Aaron over the company. She no longer had to hide from me. The gym, the marriages, and the schedules that had made everything complicated were finally out of the way. She believed that once the secrecy disappeared, she and Mason would get to find out what their relationship looked like in normal life. For about 3 months, they tried. I knew only what Samantha later told me and what one mutual acquaintance mentioned. After seeing them together, I did not follow their social media, ask friends for updates, or make their relationship part of my daily life. The only reason the details mattered at all was that Samantha had spent months insisting this was the future she had been trying to protect. At first, the relationship seemed easier. They went to restaurants openly. Samantha spent weekends with Mason instead of checking my shift calendar. There was no employees, only door, no closed gym after midnight, and no need for messages about going to sleep. The secrecy was gone, and so was much of what had made the relationship feel different. Before the fire alarm, almost every meeting had a deadline, a locked building, and a future nobody had forced through a budget, a lease, or a divorce settlement. Now they had normal evenings and normal expectations. Samantha wanted to know when they were going to build something together, while Mason wanted time before making another commitment. She asked whether he still intended to open another gym or recovery studio. Mason said the market was uncertain, and he did not want to put sale proceeds into another lease immediately. He had once expected Northline to absorb much of the groundwork. Now every new location would begin with his own capital on the line. She asked whether they should live together. He said the divorce was already expensive, and he wanted to keep finances separate for a while. She asked what happened to the plans they had made before Northline was sold. Mason said the circumstances were different. The man who had spent months telling Samantha that life should not be ruled by waiting had become very comfortable asking her to wait. Samantha did not leave him immediately. She had already paid too much to admit quickly that the relationship itself might not justify the cost. For several weeks, she defended him the same way she had once defended Recovery Studio. She said the sale had been stressful. Aaron had forced decisions too quickly. Mason needed to rebuild his income, and another business opportunity would eventually appear. Then the explanation changed. Samantha started saying Mason was no longer the same person he had been during the affair. From what she described, Mason thought Samantha had changed too. He told her she turned every conversation into a demand for a plan. She told him plans were exactly what he had promised. He said the affair had been different before both marriages collapsed. That sentence did more than any argument between them. The version of Samantha Mason, like most, had existed inside somebody else's stable life. She had a house, a salary, a husband, and a predictable schedule that gave them private windows. She could be spontaneous with Mason because somebody else was carrying the ordinary structure around her. Once that structure disappeared, Samantha wanted the future Mason had spent months describing. Mason wanted fewer obligations, not more. The same was true in reverse. During the affair, Mason looked adventurous because Aaron handled finance, vendors, leases, payroll, and the parts of Northline that made his spontaneity possible. After the sale, Samantha was no longer dating the owner of a successful gym with a new studio ready to launch. She was dating a divorcing fitness consultant, deciding how much of his money he was actually willing to risk. Both of them had mistaken borrowed stability for personal freedom. That was why finally being free did not solve the relationship. The secrecy had hidden the fact that neither one actually wanted to become the stable person carrying the next stage. Samantha wanted Mason to provide the bold new life he had advertised. Mason wanted relief from the obligations he already had. Their relationship ended a little over 3 months after they began seeing each other openly. There was no public scene, no accident, and no sudden financial collapse. They simply reached the point where each expected the other to justify what the affair had cost, and neither one could do it. Samantha told me about the breakup during one of the last meetings with our attorneys. We were sitting in a conference room going through final language related to the house sale when the lawyers stepped out to copy a revised page. Samantha looked at the closed door and said, "Mason and I aren't together anymore." I told her I was not surprised, which irritated her enough that she accused me of enjoying it and said I had finally gotten what I wanted. I asked what she thought I had wanted. She listed the results as if I had personally arranged all of them. Our marriage ending, Recovery Studio dying, Northline being sold, and her relationship with Mason collapsing. I shook my head. I wanted you not to lie to me. Samantha looked away and let the silence sit between us for a few seconds. After a moment, she returned to an explanation she had used more than once since the affair came out. "You were gone every third day, Jack. I was lonely." I had heard enough versions of that sentence to know she was not asking for forgiveness. She was asking me to carry part of the responsibility for what she chose to do with those nights. I answered carefully, because I wanted the responsibility to stay exactly where it belonged. Being alone for a night was part of my job. Building another life during those nights was your choice. If you needed something different from our marriage, you could have told me before you gave my schedule to him," Samantha said. I made it sound calculated. I reminded her that she and Mason had moved to dinner when I traded one of my shifts. She said that did not mean every meeting was planned around me. I thought about 14 after-hours entries, the midnight messages, the nights she said she was tired, the closed gym, and the fact that Mason knew when I could not come home. "You knew my schedule better than I did," I said. "You built the affair around it." She did not answer. There was nowhere useful for the argument to go after that. The sentence also closed the last excuse I cared about. My job had created predictable absences, but it had not created Mason, the closed gym, the fake bedtime messages, or the decision to move plans when I traded a shift. Those choices belonged to Samantha. The divorce became final several weeks later. Samantha stayed in office administration and eventually left the dental group, but not for Mason and not for a company they owned together. A later operations job with another healthcare business paid well enough, and from what I heard she did fine there. She was not ruined. She had simply lost the version of reinvention that depended on Mason making promises cheaply, while other people carried the risk. Mason stayed in fitness. After his transition agreement with the buyer ended, he did private training and consulting work. He still earned money and still had clients. What he no longer had was Northline behind every claim about what he could build next. I stayed with the department. For a while, I hated looking at my shift calendar. That bothered me more than I expected, because the calendar had been a neutral tool for 11 years. It was supposed to contain shifts, trades, overtime, training, vacation, and nothing more. After Samantha, every 24-hour block looked like evidence. The feeling faded as normal work filled the schedule again. Calls replaced associations, trades became ordinary trades, and a Saturday eventually became nothing more than a Saturday I worked. About a year after the Northline alarm, one of the younger firefighters at my station asked whether I could trade a weekend with him. His sister was getting married, and the only shift he could not get covered was Saturday. I checked my calendar. That Saturday had been open for me, but I had no important plans. Sunday mattered more because a few friends and I were driving out early to hike and stopping for dinner on the way back. The younger firefighter looked over my shoulder and said, "You sure you want Saturday? That puts you on 24 before your day off." I told him Sunday worked better for me, and we made the trade. He thanked me and walked back toward the apparatus floor. I wrote the new shift into my calendar and looked at the change for a moment. A year earlier, moving one Saturday would have changed somebody else's secret plans without me knowing it. Now, the only consequence was that I would work Saturday and hike Sunday. Nobody at home needed the information, no private dinner had to move, and no locked door would open, because I could not come back unexpectedly. It was only a work schedule again. If you enjoy stories where betrayal finally meets consequences, subscribe for the next one. This is Blood Never Lies.